Medieval Europe's most brutal execution methods. When death was just the beginning, picture this. You're standing in a crowded medieval town square. The air is thick with anticipation, and hundreds of people have gathered around a wooden platform. Children sit on their fathers' shoulders for a better view. Vendors walk through the crowd selling meat pies and ale. Everyone's chatting excitedly, like they're waiting for a festival to begin. But this isn't a celebration. This is an execution. And in medieval Europe, death wasn't just punishment. It was entertainment, spectacle, and most horrifyingly of all, it was often just the beginning of your suffering. Today, we're diving deep into the darkest corner of medieval justice, where the line between punishment and torture disappeared entirely. We'll explore execution methods so brutal that they make modern horror movies look like children's fairy tales. And here's what might shock you the most. These weren't rare occurrences carried out by sadistic individuals. These were official, legal punishments, sanctioned by the church and state, witnessed by thousands, and considered completely normal. So buckle up, because we're about to discover why medieval Europe's idea of justice would make even the most hardened criminal think twice about breaking the law. The medieval mindset. Why brutality was the point. Before we dive into the gruesome details, we need to understand something crucial about medieval thinking. In our modern world, we execute criminals to end their lives quickly. That's the punishment. But in medieval Europe, a quick death was considered merciful, almost lenient. The real punishment was the suffering that came before death. Medieval authorities believed that public, prolonged suffering served multiple purposes. First, it was supposed to give the condemned person time to repent and save their soul. Second, it was meant to deter others from committing crimes. And third, it satisfied the public's demand for justice, or what they called justice. But there's something else we need to consider. Medieval Europe was a world where life was cheap and suffering was common. People died from diseases we can cure with antibiotics today. They watched their children die from malnutrition, their wives die in childbirth, their friends die from infected wounds. In a world where suffering was everywhere, the idea of inflicting extreme suffering on criminals didn't seem as shocking as it does to us. The church played a massive role in justifying these brutal punishments. Medieval Christianity taught that earthly suffering could purify the soul and reduce time in purgatory. So torturing someone before killing them wasn't just punishment. It was actually doing them a spiritual favor. At least, that's how they justified it. Drawing and quartering, the ultimate royal punishment. Let's start with perhaps the most infamous execution method in medieval Europe, drawing and quartering. This was reserved for the worst crimes against the crown, high treason, rebellion, or plotting against the king. And when I say this was brutal, I mean it was designed to be the most horrific death imaginable. The full punishment was actually called hanged, drawn, and quartered, and it involved multiple stages of torture. Here's how it worked, and I warn you, this gets graphic. First, the condemned person would be dragged through the streets on a hurdle, basically a wooden frame, from the prison to the execution site. This wasn't just transportation. The rough streets would scrape and cut them as they were pulled along. Sometimes this journey could take hours, with the crowd throwing garbage, stones, and worse at the prisoner. Once they reached the execution site, the real horror began. The person would be hanged, but not until death. They would be left hanging just long enough to experience the agony of strangulation, but taken down while still alive. Imagine gasping for air, feeling your life slipping away, only to be cut down and told your punishment was just beginning. Next came the drawing, and this is where it gets truly medieval. The executioner would cut open the prisoner's abdomen while they were still conscious and remove their intestines. Sometimes they would burn the intestines in front of the dying person. The goal was to keep them alive and conscious for as long as possible during this process. Finally came the quartering. The person's body would be cut into 4 pieces, usually with the head removed separately. These 5 pieces, the 4 quarters and the head, would then be displayed in different parts of the city or sent to different towns as a warning to others. But here's what makes this even more disturbing. This entire process could take hours. Medieval executioners were skilled at keeping people alive through unimaginable agony. They knew exactly how much punishment a human body could endure before death, and they used that knowledge to prolong the suffering. The most famous victim of this punishment was probably William Wallace, the Scottish rebel leader whose story inspired the movie Braveheart. In 1305, Wallace was dragged through London, hanged until nearly dead, disemboweled while still alive, and then quartered. His head was placed on London Bridge, and his 4 quarters were sent to different Scottish towns as a warning. The wheel, medieval Europe's most terrifying machine. If drawing and quartering was the punishment for treason, breaking on the wheel was the go-to execution method for common criminals who committed serious crimes like murder or highway robbery. And in many ways, it was even more brutal than drawing and quartering. The wheel, also called the Catherine wheel, was a large wooden wheel, usually about 6 feet in diameter. The condemned person would be tied to this wheel with their limbs stretched out along the spokes. Then, the executioner would use a large hammer or iron bar to systematically break every major bone in their body. The executioner would start with the limbs, breaking the bones in the arms and legs in multiple places. They would be careful not to hit any vital organs. The goal was to cause maximum pain while keeping the person alive. The sound of bones breaking could be heard across the town square, and witnesses described the victim's screams as inhuman. After breaking the major bones, the executioner would weave the person's broken limbs through the spokes of the wheel, creating a grotesque human pretzel. The person would then be hoisted up on a pole for everyone to see, and here's the truly horrific part. They could survive like this for days. In some regions, the wheel punishment included what was called the coup de grace, a final blow to the chest or neck that would end the person's suffering. But this was considered an act of mercy and had to be specifically ordered by the judge. Without it, people could linger on the wheel for 2 or 3 days before finally dying from their injuries, dehydration, or exposure. One of the most documented cases of breaking on the wheel happened in 1757 to Robert-François Damien, who attempted to assassinate King Louis XV of France. Damiens was first tortured with red-hot pincers, then had his limbs attached to 4 horses that pulled in different directions. When that failed to quarter him, he was finally broken on the wheel. Witnesses said he remained conscious and spoke to his confessor for over an hour after the breaking began. The wheel was so associated with prolonged agony that the phrase "broken on the wheel" became synonymous with ultimate suffering in medieval literature and common speech. Burning at the stake, the church's favorite punishment. While the state had its preferred methods of execution, the Catholic Church had its own favorite, burning at the stake. This was the standard punishment for heresy, witchcraft, and other crimes against the faith. And the Church had very specific ideas about how burning should be carried out to maximize both physical and spiritual impact. The Church taught that fire was purifying. It could cleanse the soul of sin even as it destroyed the body. This made burning particularly appropriate for religious crimes. But medieval burning wasn't like what you see in movies, where someone is quickly overcome by smoke and dies relatively painlessly. Medieval executioners had techniques to make burning as prolonged and agonizing as possible. They would build the fire carefully, using wood that would create maximum heat and smoke, but wouldn't burn too quickly. Sometimes they would use green wood that would smolder and produce thick smoke, causing the person to suffocate slowly while also burning. The condemned person would be chained to a stake, usually with their feet barely touching the ground. As the fire was lit, it would start by burning their feet and legs, gradually working its way up their body. The pain was indescribable. Victims would scream until their lungs filled with smoke and their vocal cords were seared. But here's something truly disturbing. Sometimes the executioner would be instructed to show mercy by strangling the person before the fire reached their vital organs. This was considered a kindness, and families of the condemned would sometimes bribe the executioner to provide this quick death. The fact that strangulation was considered merciful tells you everything you need to know about how horrific burning alive really was. The church kept detailed records of burnings, and these documents reveal the calculated cruelty of the process. Executioners were given specific instructions on how to build the fire, how to position the condemned, and how to keep them conscious for as long as possible. They believed that the longer the person suffered, the more their soul would be purified. Joan of Arc is probably the most famous victim of burning, but she was far from alone. During the height of the witch trials, thousands of people, mostly women, were burned alive across Europe. In some German towns, the smoke from burning witches was so common that it became part of the daily landscape. Flaying, when they wanted to make a point. Sometimes, medieval authorities wanted to send a message that went beyond just killing someone. They wanted to create a warning so terrifying that it would be remembered for generations. That's when they turned to flaying, skinning someone alive. Flaying was rare, but when it was used, it was reserved for the most hated criminals or the most serious crimes. The process was exactly what it sounds like. The executioner would use sharp knives to carefully remove the person's skin while keeping them alive. This required incredible skill. The executioner had to remove the skin without cutting too deep and causing fatal bleeding. They had to avoid major blood vessels while peeling away the entire outer layer of the person's body. It was a slow, meticulous process that could take hours. The most famous case of flaying in medieval Europe involved Sisamnes, a corrupt judge in the Persian Empire whose story became popular in medieval European art and literature. According to the tale, Sisamnes was flayed alive for accepting bribes, and his skin was used to cover the judge's chair as a warning to future judges. This story was so popular in medieval Europe that it was painted on the walls of courtrooms and city halls. But flaying wasn't just about the physical punishment. The psychological aspect was just as important. In medieval thinking, the skin was what made you human. It was the boundary between your inner self and the world. To remove someone's skin was to literally strip away their humanity, to reduce them to something less than human. After flaying, the person's skin would sometimes be preserved and displayed as a warning. There are records of flayed skins being hung in town squares, displayed in churches, or even used to bind books. The message was clear. This is what happens to those who commit the worst crimes against society. The Brazen Bull, engineering cruelty. Medieval Europe didn't just inherit brutal execution methods from the ancient world, they improved on them. One of the most ingenious torture devices was the Brazen Bull, a hollow bronze statue of a bull with a door in its side. The condemned person would be locked inside this bronze bull, and then a fire would be lit underneath it. As the metal heated up, the person inside would literally be roasted alive. But the truly diabolical part was acoustic. The bull was designed with a series of tubes and chambers that would convert the victim's screams into sounds that resembled a bull's roar. This meant that spectators couldn't hear the human suffering. They just heard what sounded like an angry bull. This wasn't an accident. It was a deliberate design choice. The creators wanted to dehumanize the victim, to make their suffering seem less human, and therefore more acceptable to watch. The Brazen Bull required incredible metalworking skill to create. The bronze had to be thick enough to conduct heat evenly, but thin enough to heat up quickly. The acoustic chambers had to be precisely engineered to create the right sound effects. This wasn't a crude torture device. It was a sophisticated piece of engineering designed specifically for causing maximum suffering. What makes the Brazen Bull even more disturbing is that it was often used for public executions and festivals. The strange roaring sounds and the spectacle of the bronze bull would draw crowds, turning an execution into entertainment. Children would watch and listen, thinking they were seeing some kind of strange performance rather than witnessing a human being roasted alive. Sawing. The execution that defied gravity. Here's an execution method that's so brutal, it's hard to believe it was real: sawing a person in half. And the medieval Europeans had a particularly cruel twist on this ancient punishment. They would hang the person upside down before beginning to saw. Why upside down? Because when you're hanging upside down, blood flow to your brain is increased, which means you stay conscious longer. The executioners would start sawing between the person's legs, working their way down through the torso. Because of the inverted position, the person would remain conscious until the saw reached their vital organs, which could take a very long time. This method was used primarily for adultery, particularly when a woman was caught cheating on her husband. The symbolism was intentional. The saw would divide the body, just as the person had divided their marriage. It was a punishment that fit the crime in medieval thinking, where symbolic justice was just as important as actual punishment. The sawing was done slowly and deliberately. Executioners would use a large, coarse saw that would tear through flesh and bone gradually. They would take breaks to allow the crowd to see the progress and to give the condemned person time to contemplate their fate. The entire process could take several hours. Records from medieval trials show that sawing was often specifically requested by the families of victims. A husband whose wife had committed adultery could petition the court to have her sawed in half rather than simply beheaded. This was considered a more appropriate punishment because it matched the severity of her crime against the sacred institution of marriage. Impalement, the punishment that inspired legends. When we think of impalement, most people immediately think of Vlad the Impaler, the Romanian prince who inspired the Dracula legend. But impalement was used throughout medieval Europe, and the methods varied from region to region, each with its own particular cruelty. The basic concept was simple. A long, sharp stake would be inserted into the person's body, and they would be left to die slowly. But the details of how this was carried out reveal the calculated cruelty of medieval justice. The stake would usually be inserted through the rectum or vagina, then pushed through the body until it emerged from the mouth or shoulder. The key was to avoid puncturing any major organs during the insertion. The goal was to keep the person alive for as long as possible while impaled. Skilled executioners could keep someone alive on a stake for days. The person would die slowly from blood loss, infection, or exposure, all while being displayed publicly as a warning to others. The stake would be planted in the ground, leaving the impaled person suspended several feet in the air where everyone could see them. In some regions, multiple stakes would be used to impale several people at once, creating what was called a forest of stakes. This was particularly common during times of rebellion or civil unrest, when authorities wanted to make a dramatic statement about the consequences of defying the law. Vlad the Impaler was famous for impaling thousands of people during his reign in the 15th century. Contemporary accounts describe forests of stakes surrounding his castle, with impaled bodies in various stages of decay. The smell alone was said to be overwhelming, and visitors could hear the moans and cries of those still dying on the stakes. But Vlad wasn't unique. He was just more prolific than most. Impalement was a recognized form of execution throughout Europe, used for crimes ranging from treason to theft, depending on local laws and customs. The Catherine wheel, a saint's martyrdom becomes a torture device. The Catherine wheel, named after Saint Catherine of Alexandria, was another variation of the breaking wheel, but with an added element of fire. According to legend, St. Catherine was sentenced to be broken on a spiked wheel, but the wheel broke when she touched it, so she was beheaded instead. Medieval executioners took this legend and created their own version of Catherine's wheel, one that wouldn't break. The Catherine wheel was a large wheel studded with sharp spikes or knives. The condemned person would be tied to the wheel, and then it would be slowly rotated over a fire. As the wheel turned, the spikes would cut into the person's flesh while the fire burned them from below. This combination of cutting and burning was designed to maximize pain while preventing the person from losing consciousness. The constant rotation meant that no part of the body was spared, and the fire kept the wounds from becoming numb. It was a punishment that combined the worst aspects of several different execution methods. The Catherine wheel was often used for crimes against the church, particularly for those who had renounced their faith or committed sacrilege. The irony of using a saint's name for such a brutal punishment wasn't lost on medieval authorities. It was intentional. They saw it as poetic justice that those who had betrayed the faith would suffer on a device named after a faithful martyr. Boiling, the punishment for poisoners. In 1531, Henry VIII of England made poisoning a capital crime punishable by boiling alive. This wasn't just any ordinary execution. It was specifically designed to match the crime. Just as the poisoner had caused their victim to suffer internal agony, the poisoner would suffer the agony of being slowly cooked alive. The condemned person would be lowered into a large cauldron of water that was gradually heated. Sometimes oil would be used instead of water, as it could reach higher temperatures. The key was to start with cool liquid and slowly increase the temperature, so the person would experience every degree of heat as their body was literally cooked. The first recorded victim of this punishment was Richard Rouse, a cook who had poisoned several people in the household of the Bishop of Rochester. Rose was lowered into a cauldron at Smithfield Market in London while thousands watched. Contemporary accounts describe his screams as inhuman, and witnesses said the smell of cooking flesh was overwhelming. The boiling process was carefully controlled. The executioner would monitor the temperature to ensure the person didn't die too quickly from shock. They wanted the victim to experience the full horror of feeling their flesh cook while they were still conscious. This could take over an hour, with the person's skin gradually turning red, then white, then beginning to peel away. What makes this punishment particularly disturbing is how it was justified. Authorities argued that since poisoners killed their victims secretly and caused them to suffer internal agony, it was only fair that poisoners should suffer a similar fate. It was considered proportional justice. The punishment should mirror the crime. The rack. Stretching the limits of human endurance. While not technically an execution method, the rack deserves mention because it was often used in combination with other punishments, and because it could easily kill if taken too far. The rack was a rectangular frame with a windlass at one end, and it was designed to stretch the human body beyond its natural limits. The condemned person would be tied to the rack with their wrists and ankles attached to opposite ends. Then, the windlass would be slowly turned, stretching the person's body. The pain was immediate and intense. Medieval accounts describe it as feeling like your limbs were being torn from your body. As the stretching continued, joints would begin to dislocate. First the shoulders, then the hips, then the knees and elbows. The popping sounds of dislocating joints could be heard across the torture chamber. But skilled operators could continue stretching even after dislocation, actually lengthening the person's body by several inches. The rack was particularly cruel because it offered the illusion of escape. At any point, the victim could confess to their crimes or provide information, and the stretching would stop. This created a psychological torture alongside the physical pain, the constant hope that the suffering might end if they just gave up the information their torturers wanted. Many people died on the rack, their bodies literally torn apart by the stretching mechanism. Others survived but were permanently disabled, their joints never recovering from the extreme dislocation. The rack was considered one of the most effective torture devices because it could extract confessions while keeping the person alive for trial and execution. The scavenger's daughter. The rack's opposite. Where the rack stretched the body apart, the scavenger's daughter compressed it together. This device, invented in the 16th century, consisted of a metal frame that would force the person into an extremely compact position, with their knees pushed up against their chest and their hands forced down toward their feet. The compression was gradually increased using a screw mechanism, forcing the person's body into an impossibly small space. This caused different but equally intense suffering. Instead of feeling like their limbs were being torn off, victims felt like they were being crushed from all sides. The compressed position made breathing extremely difficult, and the pressure on internal organs was immense. Blood would be forced out through the nose, mouth, and even the pores of the skin. The person's ribs would crack under the pressure, and their spine would compress, causing excruciating pain. Like the rack, the scavenger's daughter was designed to extract confessions rather than to kill, but it frequently resulted in death anyway. The human body simply wasn't designed to withstand such extreme compression, and many victims died from internal injuries or suffocation while trapped in the device. The psychology of public execution. What makes all of these execution methods even more disturbing is that they weren't carried out in secret. They were public events, attended by hundreds or thousands of people. Entire families would come to watch executions, treating them like entertainment or educational opportunities. Medieval authorities believed that public executions served several purposes. They demonstrated the power of the state and the church. They deterred others from committing crimes, and they satisfied the public's desire for justice. But they also served a darker purpose. They normalized violence and suffering in ways that would be unthinkable today. Children grew up watching people being tortured and killed in the most brutal ways imaginable. This wasn't considered traumatic or inappropriate. It was considered part of their education about justice and morality. They learned that certain crimes deserved certain punishments, and that extreme suffering was not only acceptable but necessary for serious wrongdoing. The crowds at executions weren't silent, respectful observers. They were active participants, cheering, jeering, and sometimes even participating in the torture. They would throw objects at the condemned person, shout insults, and celebrate when particularly hated criminals died. The execution became a communal event, bonding the community together in their shared approval of the punishment. The end of an era. These brutal execution methods didn't disappear overnight. Many continued well into the 18th and even 19th centuries in some parts of Europe. But gradually, ideas about justice, human rights, and appropriate punishment began to change. The Enlightenment brought new ideas about human dignity and the purpose of punishment. Philosophers like Cesare Beccaria argued that punishment should be swift, certain, and proportional to the crime, not prolonged, torturous, and designed to cause maximum suffering. These ideas slowly took hold, and brutal execution methods were gradually replaced by quicker, more humane alternatives. But the legacy of medieval execution methods lived on in other ways. They became part of folklore, literature, and popular culture. They shaped our understanding of medieval Europe as a particularly dark and violent period in human history. And they remind us of how dramatically ideas about justice, punishment, and human dignity can change over time. Conclusion: Understanding medieval justice. As we've seen, medieval Europe's approach to execution was about much more than just ending someone's life. It was about creating spectacle, demonstrating power, satisfying public bloodlust, and sending messages that would last for generations. These weren't just punishments. They were carefully orchestrated performances designed to reinforce social order and religious authority. The brutality of these methods shocks us today, but it's important to understand them in their historical context. Medieval Europe was a world where life was cheap, suffering was common, and the line between justice and revenge was often blurred. These execution methods weren't the products of individual sadism. They were the official, legal punishments of their time, approved by kings and blessed by the church. Understanding this dark chapter of human history doesn't mean excusing it or accepting it. Instead, It helps us appreciate how far we've come in our understanding of human rights, dignity, and justice. It reminds us that our modern ideas about appropriate punishment aren't universal truths. They're hard-won achievements that previous generations fought and died to establish. The next time you read about medieval Europe, remember that behind the castles and knights, behind the art and architecture, behind the myths and legends, there was also this darker reality, a world where justice was brutal, where suffering was entertainment, and where death was often just the beginning of punishment. These stories matter because they're part of our shared human heritage, both the capacity for incredible cruelty and the gradual recognition that such cruelty is wrong. They remind us that progress isn't automatic, that human rights aren't guaranteed, and that the values we hold dear today had to be fought for, defended, and constantly renewed.